Hello, my name is Lainey Morin, and this is my narrated PowerPoint for History 101 in George Mynads' class. The topic for my presentation is the cult of Dionysus. Before I get into the cult and the history behind all of that, I want to explain Dionysus' background and how his background led to the formation of his cult. So Dionysus is the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, and he is the last of the 12 Olympian gods. So starting at birth, Dionysus's birth was actually quite eventful, and he was actually technically born twice. He is the son of Zeus and Semele. Zeus is one of the 12 Olympian gods as well, and he is the god of lightning and sky, and he is considered the ruler, the protector, and the father of all gods and humans. And Dionysus's mother, Semele, is the daughter of Cadmus, who is the king of Thebes. And so Zeus cheated on his wife, Hera, with Semele, which led to her pregnancy. And then, out of jealousy, Hera convinced Semele to get Zeus to prove his love by appearing in his human form. And since Semele was immortal, Zeus's power was too strong, and she was actually struck by lightning as he was going into his human form. And while she was struck by lightning, Semele was killed, and so to save his son, Zeus took Dionysus and sewed him into his thigh until he was ready to be born again, hence how he was born twice. And even after his birth, Hera was still very jealous, and then to protect Dionysus from Hera, he was taken to Mount Naisa shortly after his birth. While he was there, he was raised by Silenus, as pictured right here, who was the rustic god of drunkenness and winemaking, along with the rain nymphs, also called the Hyades, who were responsible for bringing the rains. So Silenus was the foster father to Dionysus, and he taught him how to drink and party while he raised him. Once Dionysus was grown up, he learned how to cultivate grapes into wine, and he was the first to do so. And he wanted to spread his discovery, so he wandered across Asia, and he taught his winemaking process to the mortals. And while he was wandering Asia, along with teaching them how to make wine, he also spread his beliefs and began to accumulate a small following of a few women who would go with him as he was spreading his winemaking teaching. After years of roaming Asia, he returned to his birthplace of Mount Olympus, pictured right here. And once he arrived, he was the last of the 12 Olympian gods to arrive. After arriving to Mount Olympus, Dionysus was considered an outsider. The reasoning behind this was because he was the only one that had a mortal mother. He was raised somewhere else, and because he spent years roaming throughout Asia, his identity as a foreigner is an important part of the formation of his cult, though. Dionysus has a total of 9 children. The first child is Priapus, and his mother is Aphrodite, who is the goddess of beauty. And Priapus is the rustic fertility god, and he is the protector of livestock and plants. His next child is Hymenos, whose mother was also Aphrodite, and Hymenos was the god of weddings and the wedding hymn. And so Dionysus and his wife, Princess Ariadne, had many children together, which include the following: Theos, Stephanos, and Oenopion. And so Theos was not a god, but he was the king of a Greek island named Lemnos. And then Stephalos was also a king, and he ruled over a island of Thasos. And then was Oenopion, and he was the king of the island of Kehios. And then next is his son of Komos, and his mother is Circe, who is the goddess of sorcery. Komos is the god of festivity and revels, and he represents anarchy and chaos. And then next is his daughter, the Graces, which is the goddess of charm, beauty, nature, human creativity, goodwill, and fertility. And her mother is Eurydice. And then the last of Dionysus's children is Deianira, and her mother is Athelia, which was the queen of Chaldean, which makes Deianira the princess of Chaldean. And so now on to the powers and why Dionysus was so important in Greek history and mythology. So Dionysus is the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, and because he's the god of wine, he had the power to grow vines. And like all Greek gods, he was immortal, and he was also able to change himself into animals, mostly like a bull or a lion. Dionysus also had the power to cause madness and cause people to go insane, and he would actually do this to anybody that would not want to join his cult or follow what he was teaching, so he would just make them go insane. And he's the god of wine, which wine plays a huge role in the Greek culture, even thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. Wine was used in religious, social, and medical situations. And the first evidence of wine being used in Greek culture can be dated back to around 6000 BC. And theater and drama were also very important aspects of Dionysus. So, because Dionysus was the god to bring wine into Greek culture, and the evidence of the first wine can be dated back 6000 BC, that can also be used to determine the approximate time period when the cult of Dionysus started. So Dionysus was considered a benevolent god, which means that he was an all-loving and infinitely good god. And because of this reputation that he had of being very good and very loving, many people wanted to be a part of his cult and follow his beliefs. And these followers of Dionysus were called the Mynads if they were female, and the Satyrs if they were male. And the role that the Mynads, the females, played was to look after the grapevines, harvest the grapes, and to prepare the wine. And then the Satyrs didn't have as big of a role, but they would dance and drink wine. And the origin place of the Dionysus cult was in Thrace, Greece. And so now on to how they would worship Dionysus in this cult. And during their worship rituals, the Mynads would drink to feel as though they were possessed by Dionysus. And then also during worship, they would dance naked throughout the forests of Thrace, usually to a point of exhaustion. And this combination of drinking and sexual activities allowed his followers to reach a state of ecstasy. And then during this state of ecstasy, they were able to see the future events. They had superhuman strength and could be connected to the divine forces. And also to worship Dionysus, they held festivals. And Dionysus had 4 festivals dedicated to him. The first was the city of Dionysia. The second was the Anthesteria. Then was the Lanaya. And then the rural Dionysia. And these festivals were held to honor and worship Dionysus, and generally consisted of drinking, dancing, and theater. And some of them had specific traditions and customs. So the first festival I'm going to go over is the city Dionysia. And the city Dionysia was held in Athens, and it was held in March. And it was to honor Dionysus. Tragedy, comedy, and satiric drama all originate from the city Dionysia festival. tragedy was first introduced in 534 BC by the tyrant Pisistratus. The earliest tragedy that still survives to this day is from 472 BC, and it is called the Persei, or Persians in English, by Aeschylus. And this tragedy focuses on the Battle of Salamis between Greece and Persia. And then comedy was introduced in the year 486 BC. And then at this festival, competitions were held to see which poet could write the best tragedy or comedy. And in the tragedy competitions, 3 different poets competed. And in comedy competitions, 5 different poets competed against each other. So then the judges would decide which was the best, and they would receive a prize. And the city of Dionysia festival would last 6 days and was attended by all of the Athens civilians as well as people from all over Greece. So the next festival is called the Anthesteria, and this festival lasted 3 days and happened on the 11th, 12th, and 13th of February. The name Anthesteria translates to blossoming of flowers in English. And so each day of this festival had a different name and served a different purpose. And so starting off with the first day was called the Pythagogia, which means wine cast opening. And this day symbolized the beginning of the festivities as the wine poured out. The word pythos can also be translated to refer to the urns that people would be buried in, and people would put their loved ones' ashes into. So these urns would be buried, and then on this day they would dig them up and open the urns to celebrate and remember their loved ones to have passed. And the second day of the festival is called the Choes, which translate to the word cups in English. And on this day, there was an annual ritual of the wedding between the ruler's wife and Dionysus. And after this ritual wedding, the wine drinking continued as it did throughout the entire festival. The second day of the festival was considered unlucky because it fell on the day of pollution on the Greek calendar. And to prevent any bad luck and to protect themselves from bad luck, the Greeks would chew on sprigs of the plant buckthorn, and they painted the front of their doors with pitch to protect themselves from any bad spirits or any bad luck. And so the second day, the main focus was to offering wine to the dead after they had risen from their urns the day before. So they would offer wine to their loved ones the day after that they released them from the urns. And so on the third and final day of Anthesteria festival, it was called Shy Troy, which when translated to English means the word pots. And on this day of the festival, there was a contest where they would act out ritual plays and dances of Dionysus. And then after the contest, they would cook a pot of grains and seeds to offer to Hermes, which was the messenger god. And the word Shaitroi can also be translated into natural hollows, which refers to all the caves throughout Greece. And these tunnels throughout Greece were believed to be openings that led to the underworld. And through these openings and tunnels, they believed that ghosts were able to travel through and used to travel to get to the underworld. And the last day of the Anthesteria was dedicated to the departure of the ghosts from the urns to the underworld, so the people could say the last goodbyes to them before they crossed over to the underworld for the rest of their life. And so the main idea of this festival was to give their loved ones a last goodbye and give them a good time before they left for the underworld. So the next festival was called the Lanaya, and the Lanaya was one of the lesser festivals, so it was not as big and not as big of a deal as the other ones that was held to honor Dionysus. It was celebrated for 3 days in January, and it was also held in Athens. This festival celebrates fertility in both the birth of Dionysus from Zeus's thigh and the coming of spring. And as the weather got warmer and it was coming closer to spring, the soil would be thawing and would get ready to be sowed for crops to be planted. And similar to the City of Dionysia festival, 5 poets competed for Best Comedy. And for the competition of the Best Tragedy, it was a little bit different, and only 2 people competed, and they both each wrote 2 tragedies. And so also this festival did not include the satire plays nor the singing and dances of the Dilthy Lambs. The Lanai was held in the Lanaion, and then it later moved to the Theater of Dionysus in around the 5th century BC. And so the last festival that was held for Dionysus was the rural Dionysia. And the rural Dionysia was held during the winter month of Poseidon, which roughly translates to the month of December, or maybe beginning of January, around that time frame. And this festival was originally from Attica, which is a rural city on Greece's countryside. The rural Dionysia was an opportunity for communities to create a local celebration that was similar to the one of the city Dionysia. And so many small communities could celebrate at the same time, or roughly the same time, in different locations all throughout Attica and all throughout the countryside of Greece. And this was also a time where a lot of people could travel throughout Greece to celebrate at different places. If they hadn't gotten a time throughout the year to travel, this was the best time to travel. And the main celebration of this festival was the Pompeii, where the symbol of Phallos, which was the sign for fertility, was carried while singing and dancing. And then along with this, young girls would carry baskets of either bread or jars of water and wine. And then there was a sacrifice of the baked bread to end the ceremony. And after the Pompeii, there was also contests of dancing and singing. And so this here is the Theater of Dionysus. And this theater was a central part of the cult and the beliefs and teachings of Dionysus. So there was a theater built in his honor that could host worship, plays, and then eventually a festival, and some festivals were held here. The Theater of Dionysus is located on the south side of the Acropolis in Athens, and the theater was constructed in the 6th century BC and was added to and expanded as time went on. All classical Greek plays were first performed here in this theater. And many of the famous ancient Greek poets who wrote plays first showed their work here. And so its peak was during between the 4th and 5th century BC, and during this peak, the theater could seat up to 17,000 people. And around the 4th century AD, the theater was not used as frequently, and so it started to decay, and that was kind of around the time that the cult of Dionysus also started to decay and started to not be a thing. And another structure that was built in honor of Dionysus was the Temple of Dionysus Lysios. And the Temple of Dionysus Lysios is located in Thebes, Greece, and is one of the main cult centers for the cult of Dionysus. So a lot of worship, a lot of drinking wine, and a lot of different rituals were held here. And the location of this temple is actually very important because the city of Thebes is very important to Dionysus because that is where his mother, Semele, died when she was struck by lightning. And then also her tomb is buried somewhere in the city of Thebes. And this temple was built in around the 6th century BC. So then, in conclusion, just to wrap up everything that I went over, Dionysus's life, as it started, he had a pretty rough upbringing, and then he was sent away and with a foster family, and then he wandered Asia to spread his belief, to start getting the cult going, and also to spread his new creation of turning grapes into wine. And then the main ideas that surrounded the cult of Dionysus were mainly focused on, obviously, wine, drinking, dancing, theater like tragedies, comedies, and satire theater. And then also there were celebrations that respected the dead and let them go peacefully to the underworld. And then most of the festivals were also centered around drinking, dancing, theater, and then the downfall of the cult of Dionysus was mostly due to Greek city-states just not accepting and kind of not allowing the cult of Dionysus, just because it didn't really align with the modern Greek beliefs as time went on. And so after time, the cult just started to dissipate, and not as many people, and it wasn't as strong because there wasn't as many people. And so now onto my works cited. So the first one is Ritual Text for the Afterlife, and this gave a lot of information about, and so this source gave me a lot of information about how the Greeks saw the afterlife and just the different aspects of how the afterlife worked in Greek religion and practices. And so the next source that I used was Ancient Greek Religion by John D. Michelson. And so this one gave me a lot of information about what the Greeks believed in during this time, and then it also had a lot of information about all the different cults, the cult of Dionysus being one of them, and just how they differed and how they were different from each other, and how it changed over time, because it changed a little bit from the beginning to the end of how it ended. And the next one is Civic Rights, Democracy, and Religion in Ancient Athens by Nancy Evans. And so this one also gave me a lot of information about the different religions during the ancient Greek times. But then it also gave a lot of information about what life was like and how the people were during the time in ancient Greece. And it also gave a lot of information about how all the different cults and religions kind of maybe clashed a little bit, and how they all had differing views. And so the next one is Redefining Dionysus by Alberto Bernabe. And this source gave me a lot of information about the different festivals that Dionysus had in honor of him, and just like what happened at those festivals, what the purpose of them was, and the different rituals and customs they had to celebrate and worship Dionysus. And the next source is The 12 Olympians, Gods and Goddesses of Greece by Dr. Charles T. Seltman. And so this source gave me so much information about like Dionysus, like what he was, all of his children, and like the background behind each of them. And this source also gave me a lot of information about Dionysus's like backstory, like when he was an orphan and then was out throughout Asia, and then his coming back, like it just gave the full story about him. And so the last source is Sacred Words, Orality, Literacy and Religion, Orality and Literacy in the Ancient World, Volume 8 by André Lardinois. And so this source gave me the most information about all of the drama that and theater that went into the cult of Dionysus. And so this source really went into depth of like the history and formation of comedy and of tragedy and all of the famous and first plays that were written and performed like in the theater of Dionysus.